Hey everyone, welcome back. This is James from The World's Last Night. Guys, I don't have too much time tonight, so I'm just going to actually read you a passage from Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, because this is where that passage I sort of previously mentioned is about him comparing morality, three different types of morality, to a fleet of ships. And I didn't give that analogy properly, so I wanted to give it its due because it's definitely a portion of the book that stood out to me upon my first read of Mere Christianity. Now, if you don't know, Mere Christianity was a book written by C.S. Lewis in the 1940s. He actually originally gave it as a series of discussions on the British public radio station. He was asked to come on the radio station to talk about Christianity. And basically, this was during the height of the war, and you can imagine what's going through the population's mind at this time, where they're sending people off to go to war, to die in battle, where London itself is under air raids because the German Luftwaffe are dropping bombs on them by night. And they're having to try to fight this air war over their cities. At the same time, there's a ground war going on in France. So in any case, it's a very scary moment. And then here's C.S. Lewis coming on the radio each evening to give a small talk about Christianity. And he's comparing it frequently to different war imagery to reach the culture and the people of his day. Now, Lewis himself actually served in World War I, not in World War II. He was too old at that time. In any case, he talked about all kinds of things from like morality, which we're going to read about here, but also very encouraging things about Jesus Christ and salvation and life after death. And these are things that if you are in a culture that's at war, you want to know about. So I'm just going to read this passage and then maybe discuss it a little bit at the end. One more thing. The name Mere Christianity, he basically called it that because he wanted to focus on the things that just about all Christians agree on. There's lots of tertiary or, secondary doctrines that Christians disagree on, but in his book, he wanted to sort of focus on the main points of it and to kind of explain to an unbeliever what Mere Christianity is. Here we go. So this is page 42 in the version I'm reading from. And he says, now let's go on a step further. All right, he says, there are two ways in which the human machine goes wrong. One is when human individuals drift apart from one another, or else collide with one another, and do one another damage by cheating or bullying. The other is when things go wrong inside the individual, when the different parts of him, his different faculties and desires and so on, either drift apart or interfere with one another. You can get the idea plain if you think of us as a fleet of ships sailing in formation. The voyage will be a success only, in the first place, if the ships do not collide and get in one another's way, and secondly, if each ship is seaworthy and has her engines in good order. As a matter of fact, you cannot have either of these two things without the other. If the ship keeps on having collisions, they will no longer remain seaworthy very long. On the other hand, if their steering gears are out of order, they will not be able to avoid collisions. Or if you like, think of humanity as a band playing a tune. To get a good result, you need two things. Each player's individual instrument must be in tune, and also each must come in at the right moment so as to combine with all the others. But there is one thing we have not yet taken into account. We have not asked where the fleet is trying to get to, or what piece of music the band is trying to play. The instruments might be all in tune and might all come in at the right moment, but even so, the performance would not be a success if they had been engaged to provide dance music and actually played nothing but dead marches. And however well the fleet sailed, its voyage would be a failure if it were meant to reach New York and actually arrived in Calcutta. Morality then seems to be concerned with three things. Firstly, with fair play and harmony between individuals. Secondly, with what might be called tidying up or harmonizing the things inside each individual. Thirdly, with the general purpose of human life as a whole, what man was made for, what course the whole fleet ought to be on, what tune the conductor of the band wants it to play. You may have noticed that modern people are nearly always thinking about the first thing and forgetting the other two. When people say in the newspaper that we are striving for Christian moral standards, they usually mean that we are striving for kindness and fair play between nations and classes and individuals. That is, they are thinking only of the first thing. When a man says about something he wants to do, it can't be wrong because it doesn't do anyone else any harm. He is thinking only of the first thing. He is thinking, it does not matter what his ship is like inside, provided that he does not run into the next ship. And it is quite natural when we start thinking about morality to begin with the first thing, with social relations. For one thing, the results of bad social morality in that sphere are so obvious and press on us every day. War and poverty and graft and lies and shoddy work. And also, as long as you stick to the first thing, there's very little disagreement about morality. Almost all people at all times have agreed, in theory, that human beings ought to be honest and kind and helpful to one another. But though it is natural to begin with all of that, if our thinking about morality stops there, we might just as well not have thought at all. Unless we go on to the second thing, the tidying up inside each human being, we are only deceiving ourselves. What is the good of telling the ships how to steer so as to avoid collision if, in fact, they are such crazy old tubs that they cannot be steered at all? What is the good of drawing up on paper rules for social behavior if we know that, in fact, our greed, cowardice, ill temper, and self-conceit are going to prevent us from keeping them? I do not mean for a moment that we ought not to think, and think hard, about improvements in our social and economic system. What I do mean is that all thinking will be mere moonshine unless we realize that nothing but the courage and unselfishness of individuals is ever going to make any system work properly. It's easy enough to remove the particular kinds of graft or bullying that go on under the present system, but as long as men are twisters or bullies, they will find some new way of carrying on the old game under the new system. You cannot make men good by law, and without good men you cannot have a good society. That is why we must go on to think about the second thing, of morality inside the individual. But I do not think we can stop there either. We are now getting to the point at which different beliefs about the universe lead to different behavior. And it would seem at first sight very sensible to stop before we go there and just carry on with those parts of morality that all sensible people agree about. But can we? Remember that religion involves a series of statements about facts, which must either be true or false. If they are true, one set of conclusions will follow about the right sailing of the human fleet. If they are false, quite a different set. For example, let us go back to the man who says that a thing cannot be wrong unless it hurts some other human being. He quite understands that he must not damage the other ships in the convoy, but he honestly thinks that what he does to his own ship is simply his own business. But does it not make a difference whether his ship is his own property or not? Does it not make a great difference whether I am, so to speak, the landlord of my own mind and body, or only a tenant responsible to the real landlord? If somebody else made me for his own purposes, then I shall have a lot of duties which I should not have if I simply belonged to myself. Again, Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever, and this must either be true or false. Now, there are a good many things which would not be worth bothering about if I were going to live only 70 years, but which I had better bother about very seriously if I'm going to live forever. Perhaps my bad temper or my jealousy are gradually getting worse, so gradually that the increase in 70 years will not be very noticeable. But it might be absolute hell in 1,000,000 years. In fact, if Christianity is true, hell is the precisely correct technical term for what it would be. And immortality makes this other difference, which, by the by, has a connection with the difference between totalitarianism and democracy. If individuals live only 70 years, then a state or a nation or a civilization which may last for 1,000 years is more important than an individual. But if Christianity is true, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important, for he is everlasting, and the life of a state or a civilization compared with his is only a moment. It seems then that if we are to think about morality, we must think of all three departments: relations between man and man, things inside each man, and relations between man and the power that made him. We can all cooperate in the first one, disagreements begin with the second, and become serious with the third. It is in dealing with the third that the main difference between Christian and non-Christian morality comes out. For the rest of this book, I'm going to assume the Christian point of view and look at the whole picture as if it will be if Christianity is true. Okay, that's the end of the passage I'm going to read to you. Now I'm just going to give you a few thoughts. First off, the reason I brought this up is because I was thinking about Shechem and the sin he committed against Dinah by raping her. Now, who knows what kind of man Shechem was? Who knows what his belief system was? or any of that. But, we can imagine that his belief system included that it may be moral to impede on what C.S. Lewis is calling that first line of morality, which is ramming the ships, into each other, or bullying, or, he came up with different kinds of sins that we commit against each other. Well, for Shechem, it didn't seem to be that bad for what he did to Dinah in his moral worldview. And honestly, since he was a prince, he could have adhered to the idea that truth comes from power, might makes right. You've heard it said that way before. Same thing that when Pontius Pilate, talks to Jesus and says, "What is truth?" Well, that's because he lived in sort of what we would consider a pre-truth age, where truth was determined by those who were in power. So whatever Caesar said, for example, and in Rome, was what was actually true. Or like Alexander the Great called himself a god, so whatever he said went. Same with Pharaoh in Egypt. So Shechem may believe that the things he does aren't wrong because he doesn't believe that he serves a higher master. Christianity rejects that. So that third morality that C.S. Lewis is talking about, where it's, you're not your own person, you are just a vessel, you are a tenant, and you owe the landlord respect, and you must do what he has asked of you because you're on borrowed time, borrowed life, borrowed finances. You're just there to be a good steward. So that third version of morality, remember the direction all humanity is sailing in, Shechem may reject because he might believe that might makes right. So now there was like a little bit of like recompense, where Shechem says, well, name your price in talking to Jacob for basically paying off whatever debt he incurred by doing such an injustice to Dinah. So he may have had his conscience condemn him a little bit, but certainly not enough. And then let's talk about that second form of morality, about making sure that everything inside you is attuned. I don't know Shechem's motives, that he was infatuated. We would consider that lust, probably. And so that's why it's important that you're always like checking yourself. Like, is there a certain sin in my life that is starting to crop up? Because we kind of go through phases of righteousness, doldrums, and then peaks, right? So it could be that where at one point in your life, money didn't mean much to you. Well, now that you might have a lot of it, is it corrupting your heart? Are you finding yourself becoming greedy? And if so, you find that in yourself, you're the first one to know outside of God. No one else knows it yet. Well, you got to work to suppress that, to put that before Jesus and say, here, this is something I've been holding on to. I've been putting it above you. It's inside me. I want rid of it. I want to clothe myself in you. I want to become more like you. And it may be that you have to start practicing giving. But ultimately, whatever you do, the object is, as some theologians might say, the object is to mortify that sin, mortify that desire. That means put it to death. So in any case, we have this obligation to, as the Bible says, take thoughts captive and submit them to Christ. So when you find in yourself something welling up like that, you want to put it out now, because who knows what that looks like, as C.S. Lewis was saying, in 10 years or in 70 years or in eternity. So the idea is that we want to cut it off now. Now, Shechem obviously didn't do that. He went on his impulses. He raped Dinah. And then now we have this sin, right, in this that has occurred, and boats have hit other boats, and it's not only offense to Dinah, but also to her family. And so that sin is sort of like creeping over. And remember what C.S. Lewis was talking about. He said basically, you can't have one without the other. Even if you keep yourself in check, he was alluding to, well, if society and others sin against you enough, then eventually you might not be able to sail and be sail-worthy yourself. And so we see that play out a lot with children that grow up in abusive households. The child may never have adopted certain deviant practices had he or she been raised properly. So children that are abused may learn that behavior and become abusers themselves. They might become bullies at school because they're bullied at home. They might be sexually abused in the home, or babysitter or whatever, and as such they might grow in that sin as they get older themselves. There's an interesting thing about serial killers. Most serial killers with sexual deviancy component to it will have statistically confessed that they have had issues with pornography in the past. So there's this idea that if you indulge in that, then it's like a secret thing. But the point C.S. Lewis is getting at is it won't always be. And in fact, obviously, like, God knows, but you're going to eventually run into that first morality issue when that secret sin comes to light or corrupts you enough that you don't have any way to steer your boat and you ram into someone else. So that's his rational argument, is basically this, that society really can't stop at passing laws to subdue sinful behavior. It has to go further and inculcate virtue in the citizenry. It has to teach virtuous practices such as discipline, repentance, faithfulness, nobility, honorable behavior in children, so as they grow up, they have integrity in themselves, which will keep them from even breaking the law to begin with. Otherwise, if you just throw out a bunch of laws and you're not actually changing the human hearts of the citizens, you're just going to have really heavily populated prisons. So I think Lewis is arguing that we need both of those. Now, the third thing he's arguing, he even says might be even the most important, because it will change all the outlook, and that is, as he said, what is your worldview? Now, you've heard that term a lot. Lewis didn't actually use that specific term. He came close to it. But what's your worldview? How do you believe this world is set up? Do you believe, like Shechem or like Pontius Pilate, that truth comes from the mighty? Or do you believe that truth comes from a God, and no matter how mighty of a human you are, you still have a master in heaven who created you and expects from you for you to follow them? So your worldview really does matter. And he talks about states, for example, and the issue with fascism and communism. Now remember, this is World War II. Germany is fascist, and the Soviet Union's communist, and England is sort of in the middle, and they're a democracy. And so he's trying to combat both ideals by basically saying, if the Christian worldview is correct, then the individual, which is a very democratic idea, you don't become absorbed into the state. The individual matters more, because the state might be gone, even if it lasts 10,000 years, which no nation ever lasts that long. The state might be gone, but the human soul endures forever. So the worldview impacts everything else. And I think that comes back to a little bit of the discussion of philosophy we had about Kantianism and utilitarianism. If the individual matters more than the society, I bumped my thing there. If the individual matters more than the state or the society, then it's important that we don't use them as a means to an end, but rather an end in themselves. So there were a lot of really good things that I loved about that passage, and I think now you can probably see a little bit more about why that popped into my head when I read that passage. So what ended up happening was that sin, the initial sin, it ended up corrupting the hearts of Simon and Levi, right? Or maybe they didn't have a good defense from it to begin with, but it spilled over to them, and suddenly they're sinning in an even greater way, which then now Jacob's concerned about all the surrounding peoples in Canaan sinning even more or in tantamount by going and slaughtering Jacob's family. And like I said, this is how wars start. This is how stereotypes and racism start, because what happens is one faction will start to raise their children to hate and or fear the other faction and tell them horror stories. And then they'll leave out their own past, right? But they'll say, yeah, Jacob's family murdered a small village, so we hate them. We hate those Israelites. And then the Israelites, they tell their children, yeah, the Canaanites, they one of them raped one of our forefathers' sisters, didn't repent from it, had the audacity to try to buy her as a wife, and they don't tell the other side either. So you start to, instead of inculcating virtue in your citizenry, you begin to plant a root of bitterness, which is what the book of Hebrews in the New Testament compares bitterness to, as a root. And we're warned as Christians to don't let one of those bitterness take root, because, well, roots are hard to dig up. And so, in any case, that's why I thought of that passage from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. I highly advise reading that book. It's wonderful. Now, the first few chapters are a little bit heady, and you might want to skip those if you don't really like the philosophy so much, but the rest of it is just really great analogies, like that ship analogy, to explain Christianity to an audience that might be new to the faith. So until next time, this is James from The World's Last Night.